The cabin seemed like a dream, an Airbnb nestled in a quiet corner of New York City, offering the perfect escape. My wife and I had been swamped with work for months, and this getaway felt like the answer. The listing promised tranquility while keeping us close enough to the city's attractions. The photos showed a charming retreat, the reviews were glowing, and the price was just right. Without a second thought, I booked it. For the first 2 days, it was everything we needed. The mornings were filled with city walks, the afternoons with quiet relaxation, and the evenings with peaceful solitude in the cozy cabin. But everything changed on the third night. I was in the kitchen, boiling water for tea, the gentle hum of the kettle filling the room. My wife was in the bedroom, reading. The night felt calm, ordinary, until she screamed. My heart stopped. I dropped everything and ran to her. She was in the corner of the room, pale as a ghost, pointing at the mirror on the wall opposite the bed. "Look," she whispered, her voice trembling. I turned to the mirror, my confusion mounting. It looked normal at first glance, but as I stepped closer, something felt off. The reflection was too clear, almost unnatural. I ran my hand over the glass, and a sickening realization washed over me. It was a two-way mirror. Her voice cracked as she pointed to the side of the frame. "There's a camera," she whispered. I felt a cold knot in my stomach as I saw it, a faint outline of a hidden lens embedded just beyond the glass. Someone had been watching us. My wife's eyes were wide with fear, and my mind raced. Who had been doing this? Why? And for how long? "We need to check the rest of the cabin," I said, my voice shaky. We tore through every room, searching for more. In the bathroom, behind the vent, we found another camera pointed directly at the shower. My nausea deepened. Every private moment we'd spent in this cabin had been recorded. Then, my wife said something that made my blood run cold. "What about the locked room?" From the moment we'd arrived, there had been one door in the cabin that was marked as off-limits. The listing had emphasized it, and we'd ignored it, assuming it was a storage space. Now, it felt sinister. "I thought I saw something move under the door," she said, her voice barely audible. My chest tightened. I knelt, peering through the narrow crack at the bottom of the door. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, just as I was about to stand, I saw it. A shadow shifting, subtle but undeniable. Someone was in there. Grabbing my phone with trembling hands, I called the police. The operator's voice was calm, reassuring, telling us to stay put until help arrived. We locked ourselves in the living room, every creak of the cabin making us jump. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, until finally, red and blue lights flickered through the windows. The police arrived, their presence both a relief and a reminder of how real this nightmare had become. We explained everything, the cameras, the mirror, and the shadow in the locked room. Their expressions hardened as they listened. 2 officers approached the door, knocking and calling out, but there was no response. Moments later, they forced it open. Inside, hunched over a desk, was the owner of the cabin. He didn't flinch as the officers stormed in, as if he had been expecting this. On the desk was a laptop, its screen alive with feeds from every hidden camera in the cabin. My stomach churned as I realized he had been watching us the entire time. He said nothing as they handcuffed him and led him outside. His face was emotionless, almost bored, like this was just another day. "You did the right thing calling us," one officer said after the man was taken away. "We'll make sure he's charged for this." But his words were cold comfort. The damage was done. Our privacy had been violated in the most intimate way. The thought of someone watching our every move made my skin crawl. We packed our things that same night, unable to stay even a minute longer. Driving away from the cabin, the city lights blurred through my tears of anger and shame. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being followed, that the owner's cold, empty stare would haunt us forever. We checked into a hotel the next morning, but sleep didn't come. Every shadow, every noise in the hallway, sent a wave of panic through me. My wife and I barely spoke, both lost in our thoughts, trying to process what had happened. Weeks later, the unease lingers. I can't look at a mirror without wondering what might be on the other side. Every time I stay somewhere unfamiliar, I search every room, every corner, as if expecting to find another camera, another violation. I'll never stay in an Airbnb again. The experience left a scar, a constant reminder that no place is ever truly safe. The world is full of hidden dangers, and sometimes they're lurking just behind the mirror. How do you ensure your safety when staying in unfamiliar places like Airbnb rentals? Have you ever had an unsettling experience while traveling? When my grandma moved into her quiet, isolated home in rural North Carolina, she'd called it her little slice of heaven. The house was modest, just 2 bedrooms, creaky wooden floors, and a kitchen that always smelled faintly of cinnamon and coffee. But to me, it was a haven. Every summer, my mom, my younger brother Sam, and I would pack up and spend a week or 2 there. For those few days, life slowed to a crawl. No cell service, no honking cars, just the rustle of trees, the buzz of cicadas, and my grandma's soothing laughter. This summer started out no different. Sam, who had just turned 18, loved wandering through the dense woods surrounding the property, while I preferred to sit on the porch with a book or help Grandma with her vegetable garden. Even Mom, who was usually glued to her work laptop, finally seemed relaxed. But all that calm came to an abrupt end on the 3rd day of our visit. It was mid-morning, and the sun was streaming through the lace curtains as we sat at the kitchen table eating breakfast. Grandma had made scrambled eggs and her signature buttery toast, and we were laughing about one of Sam's clumsy attempts to fix a broken fence post the day before. Then we heard it, a low, rumbling engine outside. It wasn't the soft putter of the mailman's car or the occasional tractor from a passing farmer. This was loud, deliberate, and far too close. Mom got up, peeking out the window. Her shoulders stiffened as she turned back to us. "There's a truck outside," she said, her voice low and uneasy. "But no one's in it." Sam and I exchanged a glance. No one drove down this road unless they had a reason to, and strangers were rare. I stood up and walked over to join Mom at the window. Sure enough, a muddy pickup truck sat idling right in front of the house, its engine humming steadily. The windows were so dirty it was impossible to see inside, but the driver's seat was visibly empty. Maybe someone got out and walked into the woods? I suggested, though I didn't believe it myself. Something about that truck sitting there, unmoving, made my skin crawl. As we stared, trying to make sense of it, a loud bang erupted from the front door. The sound was so sudden and violent that my heart jumped into my throat. Sam shot up from his chair, his eyes wide. "I'll check it," he said, his voice braver than I felt. He walked cautiously to the door and peered through the peephole. When he turned back, his face was pale. "There's no one there," he whispered. Before we could process his words, another bang rattled the door. Then came the knock at the window, sharp and deliberate. Slowly, almost unwillingly, we turned to look. Standing just outside the glass was a man. His face was partially hidden by the shadow of a worn baseball cap, and his clothes were filthy, covered in mud and streaked with something darker. "My truck broke down," he drawled, his voice gravelly and slow. "Mind if I come in and use the phone?" Mom stood up straighter, moving closer to the window. "Your truck's running just fine," she said evenly, though I could hear the tension in her voice. The man's lips twitched into a crooked smile that didn't reach his eyes. He leaned closer, pressing his face against the glass. His eyes were sharp and cold, and when he spoke again, his gaze locked onto Sam. "Any young men in there who can help me out?" he asked, his tone shifting to something darker, more insistent. Mom's voice wavered. "We don't have a phone," she said quickly. The man didn't move. He just stared at Sam, his smile fading into something more sinister. Then he began to bang on the window harder, his fists pounding like a drumbeat. "Just open the door," he demanded, his voice growing louder. "I need someone to help me." The air in the room was thick with dread. Grandma hadn't moved from her seat, but I noticed her hands trembling as they gripped her coffee cup. Sam suddenly disappeared down the hallway. When he returned, he was holding Grandma's old shotgun. It was ancient but well-maintained, a relic she kept for emergencies, though she hadn't fired it in years. Sam raised it, his knuckles white. "Leave. Now," he ordered, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. The man froze, his expression unreadable. Then, with a sudden burst of anger, He slammed both hands against the window. "You don't want to do that, boy," he snarled. Without hesitation, Sam stepped to the front door, opened it just enough to fire a warning shot into the air. The sound was deafening, shattering the fragile tension. The man didn't flinch, but he backed away slowly, his cold gaze fixed on Sam. Then, without a word, he turned, climbed into his truck, and drove off, the roar of the engine fading into the distance. Mom called the police immediately, and within 20 minutes, 2 officers were combing the area. But the man was gone. No one had seen a truck matching the description, and no tracks led away from the property. It was as if he'd vanished. That night, none of us slept. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind made us jump. Sam sat on the couch, the shotgun resting across his lap, refusing to go to bed. The next morning, when the police returned for a follow-up, one of the officers hesitated before speaking. "You're not the first to report something like this," he admitted, his tone grim. "There have been stories about a man matching that description showing up on isolated properties. People say he watches for hours before he makes his move. Sometimes, it doesn't end as well as it did for you." We left Grandma's house a day early. Even now, years later, the memory of that man still haunts me. Who was he? What did he want? And why did he fixate on Sam? I've never been able to answer those questions, but one thing is certain. That wasn't a random encounter. Sometimes, I wonder if he's still out there, driving down lonely roads, waiting for his next target. It was May 2020, right after months of being cooped up indoors. When my mom suggested a cruise as a way to unwind, I didn't hesitate. The idea of warm sun, endless ocean, and a break from the heaviness of the world was too tempting to pass up. Our extended family came along: my mom, her sister, and a few cousins. The cruise ship was massive, practically a floating city with swimming pools, theaters, restaurants, and everything you could think of. It felt like the perfect escape. The first 2 days were blissful. The air smelled like salt and freedom, and the gentle hum of the ship slicing through the water was strangely soothing. We spent our mornings indulging in buffet breakfasts, afternoons lounging by the pool, and evenings enjoying live shows. Everything felt normal, better than normal, even. But by the third morning, that easy sense of relaxation began to unravel. It started at breakfast. Around 8 a.m., we gathered in the ship's spacious dining area, a bright room with huge windows that framed the endless blue of the ocean. I filled my plate with pancakes, scrambled eggs, and bacon, then chose a table near the windows to enjoy the view. My family was still in line, chatting and laughing as they picked their food, so I sat alone for a few minutes. The warm sun streamed through the glass, and for a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then I noticed him. He sat directly across from me at another table, close enough that I couldn't miss him. At first, I thought he was just another passenger looking for a place to sit, but something about him was off. He had no food, no drink, no cup of coffee. He just sat there, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my plate. People zone out sometimes, I told myself. It's no big deal. But his stare didn't falter. It was like he wasn't just looking at me. He was studying me, dissecting me with those unervingly sharp eyes. Then, slowly, he smiled. Not a warm or friendly smile. It was more like a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes, one that sent a chill crawling up my spine. I glanced away, pretending not to notice. My heart started pounding as I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe he was just awkward or socially clueless. But when I glanced back, his gaze hadn't moved. That unsettling grin stayed fixed, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. My family finally arrived, breaking the spell. I forced myself to focus on their conversation, laughing along even though my mind was elsewhere. When I looked back again, his chair was empty. He was gone. I let out a shaky breath, trying to shake off the unease. The rest of the day went on as planned, lounging by the pool, wandering the ship, catching a late show. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But later that evening, as we walked back to our cabin, I saw him again. He was a few feet behind us, walking slowly. He wasn't trying to hide or blend in. His steps were deliberate, his pace steady, and his gaze locked on me. My stomach twisted as I caught his eyes. That same grin stretched across his face, like he was savoring some private joke only he understood. I wanted to tell my mom, but I didn't want to sound paranoid. Maybe he was just a weirdo. Maybe I was imagining things. But it didn't stop. For the rest of the cruise, I kept seeing him. At the pool, standing off to the side. In the lounge, sitting in a corner. On the promenade deck, leaning against the railing. He was always there, always watching, always smiling. I started avoiding certain areas of the ship, taking longer routes back to the cabin, sticking close to my family at all times. But no matter what I did, I couldn't escape that feeling of being watched. The last day of the cruise was supposed to be the most relaxing. We were getting ready to disembark, packing up and reminiscing about the fun we'd had. I thought maybe I'd made it through without incident. Then, as we waited in line to leave the ship, he appeared again. This time, he didn't stay in the background. He walked right up to me. My breath hitched as he leaned in close, so close I could feel the warmth of his breath against my ear. His voice was low, gravelly, and deliberate. "You're lucky," he whispered. "I changed my mind. You're safe now." I froze, every nerve in my body on fire. By the time I snapped out of it and turned around, he was gone, vanished into the crowd of passengers. I tried to process his words, but they didn't make sense. Lucky? Safe? What did he mean? What had he planned to do? My hands were shaking, my thoughts racing. I barely remember getting off the ship or the ride home. For weeks after the trip, his words haunted me. I replayed every interaction in my head, wondering what could have happened if he hadn't changed his mind. Why me? Was he watching others too? Or was I his sole focus? To this day, I don't have answers. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I feel that same heavy gaze. Like someone's eyes are on me, just out of sight. And I wonder if it's him, still watching, still waiting. What do you think he meant by "I changed my mind"? Was he truly dangerous? Or could it have been something else entirely? Have you ever experienced a stranger's actions that left you questioning their intent? The ICU has a way of making you question everything. The hum of machines, the sterile smell of antiseptic, and the flicker of fluorescent lights create a rhythm that becomes second nature over time. After 7 years working as a night nurse, I thought I'd seen it all. The chaos of emergencies, the quiet heartbreak of families saying goodbye, even the unexplainable moments that no one talks about. But nothing prepared me for the night I saw her. It was 2 a.m., the dead of night when the world outside the hospital feels like it's on pause. Inside, though, the ICU never stops. Machines beeped, patients groaned, and the ever-present buzz of the lights seemed louder than usual. I was making my usual rounds, checking vitals and restocking supplies, when I glanced down the main hallway toward the entrance. And that's when I saw her. A little girl, no older than a year, stood just inside the ICU doors. She wore a faded pink onesie with tiny ducks printed on it, her thin, wispy hair barely covering her head. She didn't cry or move. She just stood there, staring ahead with wide, dark eyes. My feet froze. My mind raced to catch up. Why was there a baby in the ICU? No one was allowed to bring children here. Too many risks, too many infections. Where were her parents? The longer I stared, the stranger it felt. She didn't look lost or scared. She was unnervingly calm, as though she belonged there. I shook off the eerie feeling and moved toward her. Surely, her parents were nearby. Maybe someone had made a mistake. But as I approached, the air shifted. It grew heavier, like walking through molasses. The lights buzzed louder, flickering sporadically. My own footsteps echoed in the silence, too loud against the polished floors. When I reached the spot where she had been standing, she was gone. Vanished. I spun around, scanning the hallway. Nothing. No stroller, no parents, no sign that she had ever been there. My heart pounded in my chest. Babies don't just disappear. Maybe she'd crawled into a room. Maybe I was overtired, imagining things. But I knew what I saw. I turned to head back and call for help when I heard it. A soft, faint giggle. It was almost a whisper, a child's laugh that sent a chill down my spine. I froze, the sound echoing faintly through the empty hallway. Slowly, I turned back toward the entrance. The hall was empty, lifeless. just as it had been a moment ago. "Are you okay?" Susan, another nurse, stood behind me. She looked exhausted, her messy bun sagging after hours of chaos, but her eyes were sharp, locked on my face. Did you see a kid?" I stammered, my voice barely steady. "A little girl. She was just here." Susan's expression didn't change. Instead of looking confused or brushing me off, she crossed her arms and nodded. "You're not the first one to see her," she said quietly, "and you won't be the last." Her words hit me like ice water. "What are you talking about?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Who is she?" Susan glanced down the hallway, then motioned for me to follow. We walked to a quieter corner, away from prying ears. She leaned in close, her voice low. "People have been seeing that little girl for years," she said. "It's always the same. Pink onesie, big dark eyes, standing near the entrance. She doesn't talk, doesn't cry. She just stares. Then she vanishes." I shook my head, trying to process. "Who is she? What happened to her?" "No one knows for sure," Susan said, her tone grim. "The rumor is years ago, a baby came through the ER, sepsis, I think. She didn't make it. They say her parents didn't get a chance to say goodbye. Ever since, nurses, doctors, even patients have seen her. She shows up randomly, usually at night." I felt sick. "And no one does anything about it?" Susan shrugged. "What can we do? There's no kid to help. She's not here, not really. Some people think it's her spirit. Others say it's just stress, the night shift messing with our heads. But you can't ignore how many people have seen her." Her words hung in the air, heavy and cold. I didn't know what to believe. My rational mind wanted to dismiss it as exhaustion or a trick of the light. But deep down, I knew what I saw. After that night, I avoided the entrance as much as I could. When I had to pass through, I glanced down the hall, half expecting to see her standing there. And every time I did, my heart would race. Even when she wasn't there, it felt like she could be. It's been months, and I still think about her. Was she a spirit, lost and wandering? A lingering echo of a tragedy that never found closure? Or was she something else entirely? Sometimes, late at night when the ICU is at its quietest, I catch myself listening for the sound of soft giggles, waiting for those big, dark eyes to appear again. And I wonder, if she does, what is it she's trying to tell us? Do you believe the little girl is a restless spirit, a shared hallucination, or something else entirely? What would you do if you were in the narrator's place? The day I met Peter was the day I began questioning everything I thought I knew about the world and about people. It wasn't an encounter that left a mark on the surface. It burrowed deeper, settling in a cold, dark corner of my memory, impossible to shake. It all started innocuously enough during my return trip to the United States from Norway. After weeks of grueling work overseas, I was eager to get back home, to shed the stress and monotony of long days. The airport was as you'd expect, busy yet impersonal, a hive of movement and muffled voices. I scrolled through my phone to kill time, vaguely aware of the surrounding chatter. Nothing seemed out of place. That sense of normalcy would not last. The man arrived quietly, settling into the seat next to mine. At first glance, he seemed like any other traveler. A man in his early 30s with a neatly kept beard, dark hair cropped short, and dressed in a black jacket and scuffed sneakers. I thought nothing of it until he introduced himself. "Hi, I'm Peter," he said, offering a smile that didn't quite meet his eyes. His voice was warm, conversational, but there was something in the way he smiled that felt off. Still, I matched his tone, responding with the polite small talk expected of strangers. He asked where I was headed, what brought me to Norway, and how I had liked the trip. Harmless questions, or so I thought. But soon, Peter's inquiries shifted. The casual pleasantries gave way to something more personal, too personal. He asked about my job, my income, where I lived. When he asked if I was rich, his tone was casual, but the words hit like a warning bell. Who asks that? Especially a stranger? I brushed it off, laughing nervously. "I make enough to get by," I replied, hoping to steer the conversation elsewhere. It didn't work. Peter kept digging, his questions sharpening in focus. Did I have family back home? Was anyone waiting for me? Had I traveled alone? Each query tightened the knot in my stomach. The way his gaze bore into mine made me feel like a trapped animal. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. When the boarding call for my flight echoed through the terminal, I felt a flood of relief. I grabbed my bag and hurried toward the gate, leaving Peter behind. Or so I thought. Fate had other plans. When I found my seat on the plane, I saw him again, just a few rows behind me. I avoided eye contact, doing my best to act normal. The flight itself was unremarkable, though the unease lingered. I closed my eyes, but instead of sleep, I replayed Peter's questions in my mind. They felt less like conversation and more like someone probing for weak spots. When we landed, I moved swiftly, weaving through the terminal in an effort to lose him. For a while, I thought I'd succeeded. Then, just as I was nearing the exit, I felt it, a presence behind me. I turned, and there he was. "Hey, Henry," he called out, his voice casual as though we were old friends. My heart thudded painfully against my ribs. Peter approached, holding something in his hand. A gold watch, intricately designed and gleaming under the fluorescent lights. It looked expensive, something that didn't belong to him. "I took this off a guy on the plane," Peter said, his voice low, tinged with amusement. He didn't even notice. I stared at him, my pulse racing. The implications of his words sank in fast. Peter wasn't just an unnerving stranger. He was a thief, and potentially something much worse. My unease turned to full-blown fear. "Don't tell anyone," he said, his grin fading. His tone dropped, dark and menacing. "Or you'll be next." The chill in his voice froze me in place. For a moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. The playful facade from earlier was gone, replaced by something predatory. He wasn't joking. He was issuing a warning, a promise. I nodded mutely, unable to speak. Every instinct screamed at me to get away from him as fast as possible. Without another word, I turned and walked into the crowd. My hands trembled, and my breath came in shallow gasps. Even as I put distance between us, I felt his eyes on my back. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The rest of my journey passed in a haze of dread. I checked over my shoulder constantly, half expecting Peter to appear. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice. The weight of his words pressed down on me long after I reached the safety of my home. I never saw Peter again, and I count myself lucky for that. But the encounter left a scar, a lingering paranoia that shadows me to this day. Who was Peter, really? Was he just a thief? Or was there something more sinister behind those probing questions and that eerie smile? What might have happened if I'd crossed him? Sometimes, late at night, I wonder if Peter is still out there, choosing his next target. And sometimes I wonder, why me? What did he see in me that day? It's a question I'll never be able to answer. But one thing is certain, I'll never forget the day I met Peter. What would you have done in my situation? Would you have reported him? Or would the fear have kept you silent like it did me? I was 9 years old in July 2019, too young to understand how one ordinary day could turn into a nightmare. It was a warm summer afternoon, and the sun painted long streaks of gold across our living room floor as I played with my toy cars, humming softly to myself. Life was peaceful, predictable, until the phone rang. I didn't think much of it at first, but my mom's voice changed as she spoke, low and hurried. I peeked toward the kitchen, noticing the way her hand trembled as she clutched the receiver. Her face was pale when she walked into the living room, kneeling in front of me. "Honey," she said, her voice trembling just enough to unsettle me. "Your dad's had an accident. He's in the hospital, and I need to go see him." The lump in my throat made it hard to speak, but I managed a nod. Mom reassured me it wasn't serious, but her eyes betrayed her worry. Because I was too young to accompany her, she decided I'd stay with our neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, who lived next door. "She's nice," Mom said with a strained smile. "You'll be safe with her." I'd seen Mrs. Jenkins a handful of times before. An elderly woman with silver hair always tied in a neat bun and glasses that perched precariously on her nose. Her house smelled like cinnamon and freshly baked cookies, and she greeted us warmly when we knocked on her door. Come in," she said, her voice soft and welcoming. The house felt like it was stuck in time, with lace doilies on the furniture and porcelain knickknacks everywhere. The coziness was almost enough to put me at ease. Almost. "Don't worry," Mrs. Jenkins told Mom as she patted my shoulder. "He'll be just fine with me." After Mom left, I settled into the living room, nibbling on a cookie while watching an old black and white movie on TV. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a large antique clock on the wall. It might have been the peacefulness of the house or the unfamiliar surroundings, but something began to feel off. Across the living room, there was a door slightly ajar. I couldn't see inside, but every now and then, Mrs. Jenkins would disappear through it. She'd stay in there for a few minutes, then return without a word. My curiosity grew with each trip she made. What was in that room? Why did she keep going in there? At first, I imagined innocent explanations. Maybe it was a storage room or a pantry. But there were no sounds, no indication of what might be inside. I finally worked up the nerve to ask, "Mrs. Jenkins, is there someone in that room?" Her warm demeanor evaporated instantly. Her eyes hardened, and her lips pressed into a thin line. "There's no one in there," she said, her voice low and cold. "Stay out of that room." Her tone sent a chill through me. I quickly nodded, not wanting to upset her further. For the rest of the afternoon, I avoided looking at the door, but the curiosity gnawed at me. When she stepped out later, muttering something about needing to pick up milk from the market, the temptation became unbearable. "Don't move. Don't touch anything," she warned before leaving. The moment the door closed behind her, I felt like the air in the house shifted. I stood, my legs shaky, and moved toward the mysterious door. My heart pounded as I gripped the doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before turning it. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit room with thick curtains drawn over the windows. At first, the room looked empty, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw him. A boy, probably around 15, lying on a bed. His arms and legs were bound to the bedposts with thick ropes, and a cloth was tied tightly over his mouth. His wide, terrified eyes locked onto mine, silently begging for help. I froze, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind raced. Who was he? Why was he tied up? A surge of panic jolted me into action. I turned and ran out of the house, grabbing my mom's phone from my pocket as I bolted toward the sidewalk. My hands shook so badly it took 2 tries to dial her number. "Mom," I stammered, my voice breaking. "There's a boy tied up in Mrs. Jenkins' house." She gasped, her voice urgent. "Stay outside. Don't go back in. I'm calling the police." I waited on the curb, trembling, as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours. When the police finally arrived, I pointed them toward the house, barely able to form words. They rushed in, and a few moments later, they emerged with the boy. His face was pale, his body trembling, but he was alive, safe. Mrs. Jenkins, however, was led out in handcuffs, her expression cold and unrepentant. Later, we learned that the boy had been missing for weeks. The police had been searching for him, but no one had thought to check Mrs. Jenkins' home. The quiet, sweet neighbor turned out to be hiding a horrifying secret. What haunted me most was that no one could explain why. She had no family, no history of criminal behavior. The boy didn't recognize her and had no idea why she'd taken him. Even now, years later, I can't make sense of it. Sometimes I lie awake at night, wondering what would have happened if I hadn't opened that door. What if I hadn't been curious? Would the boy still be there, hidden behind the lace curtains and the scent of cinnamon cookies? I'll never know the full truth, but one thing is certain. Some secrets are darker than we can imagine. What do you think Mrs. Jenkins' motive was? Was she just a lonely old woman with a dark side? Or was there something more sinister behind her actions? Share your theories.